Welcome to Beyond the Rings, the channel where we don't do plot recaps, we do the thing where you pull one loose thread out of the legendarium and keep pulling until half the tapestry is on the floor and you understand the pattern better than you did before you started. If this is your first time in this pub, grab a seat. We cite our sources here. We have opinions about which HarperCollins printing you should own, and nobody's going to explain to you who Sauron is like you just wandered in off the street. If you've been here before, you know the format. No recap, no filler, straight into the deep cuts. Tonight's subject has been sitting in my drafts folder for months because I kept second-guessing whether it was too niche even for this channel. And then I reread the essay in The Peoples of Middle-earth, where Christopher Tolkien basically throws up his hands about it, and I thought, no, actually, this is exactly the kind of mess this channel exists to dig through. We're talking about Glorfindel, not the power-scaling YouTube version of Glorfindel, the one who gets slotted into tier lists next to Gandalf, like this is a fighting game roster. The actual Glorfindel, the one Tolkien himself wasn't sure about for the better part of his writing life, the one whose entire existence is a walking argument about providence, restraint, and grief. And the title isn't clickbait. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why the only elf who could face Sauron is true, and why it doesn't mean what you think it means right now. Let's start with the mess itself, because you can't understand any of the 5 premises we're covering tonight without understanding why this character is structurally weird to begin with. There are 2 Glorfindels in Tolkien's papers. The first shows up in the account of the fall of Gondolin, one of the oldest stories Tolkien ever wrote, dating back to before the First World War had even finished chewing through his generation. This Glorfindel is a lord of the House of the Golden Flower, one of the noble houses of the Hidden City, and he dies covering the retreat of the refugees, locked in single combat with a Balrog on a crag above the mountain pass, both of them going over the edge together into the depths. It's one of the most vivid death scenes in the entire legendarium, and for decades that was the end of the character. Dead. First Age. Book closed. Then, in The Lord of the Rings, written literally decades later, a completely different Glorfindel shows up in Rivendell, riding out to meet Frodo and the others on the road, casually outriding the 9 riders, and standing at the Ford of Bruinen, doing something none of the hobbits, none of Aragorn's rangers, nobody else in that entire company could do, making the Witch King of Angmar and his companions hesitate, same name. And for a long time, Tolkien himself hadn't decided whether that was intentional. There's evidence in his working notes that at one point he considered this being a coincidence of naming, the way 2 real people might share a name 1,000 years apart. It's only very late in his life, in material collected in Home 12, that he sits down and writes an essay settling it for good. It is the same elf. The Glorfindel of Gondolin and the Glorfindel of Rivendell are one continuous person, and Tolkien doesn't just assert this. He explains the metaphysics of how it's possible. That essay is the foundation for literally everything else we're going to talk about tonight, so keep it in your back pocket. We'll come back to it more than once. Premise 1, and the one that unlocks all the others. This is not a simple resurrection, and if you're picturing it like a video game respawn, you're already misreading the theology Tolkien built underneath it. Here's how death and rebirth normally work for an elf in this legendarium, according to the material gathered in laws and customs among the Eldar in Home 10. When an elf dies, the fear, the spirit, and Tolkien is very deliberate about not just calling this a soul in the casual Christian sense, because elvish spirits are bound to ardor in a way human souls aren't. The fear goes to the halls of Mandos in Valinor. It doesn't get a body back automatically. It waits. Sometimes it waits a very long time, depending on the weight of grief or guilt or trauma the spirit is carrying, and depending on Mandos's own judgment about whether the spirit is fit to be rehoused. Eventually, if all goes well, a new Hura, a new physical body, is grown for it, slowly, and the spirit is reunited with a body, and the elf effectively returns to life in Valinor, chastened, changed, sometimes permanently altered by what happened to them. Glorfindel does not get the slow version, and Tolkien is explicit about why. The late essay describes his return as an exceptional case, a spirit judged not just fit, but valuable enough that the Valar themselves authorized an accelerated return, and not just a return to life in Aman, but a return to Middle-earth specifically, redeployed as an instrument against the growing shadow of Sauron in the Second Age. Read that again, because it's a bigger claim than it sounds like on first pass. This isn't an elf came back to life. This is the closest thing to a direct commission from the Valar that any named individual character receives anywhere in the Legendarium outside of the Istari themselves. And if you take Tolkien's own metaphysics seriously, where the fear is supposed to be the dominant ordering, shaping principle over the Hura, and where a normal incarnate life involves that dominance being constrained, worn down, made imperfect by the realities of a physical body in a marred world, then a Hura built under direct Valarin sanction for a spirit that already proved itself in the worst circumstances imaginable at Gondolin is not going to behave like an ordinary body. It's a vessel where the Fëa is allowed to show through almost unfiltered. That's the actual mechanical explanation for why he can stand at a river crossing and make 9 Ringwraiths think twice before crossing it. It's not raw stat inflation. It's what happens when Tolkien's own rules about spirit dominating flesh are allowed to run with almost no friction, because the flesh in question was built specifically to allow that. And there's a detail worth sitting on here that most breakdowns skip entirely. This makes Glorfindel functionally unique among every named character in the entire published corpus. Nobody else gets this. Other elves die and are eventually rehoused through the ordinary process. We're told this happens, generically, but we're never shown a single other named individual going through it on page the way Glorfindel's return is treated. Fëanor, famously, is judged too dangerous and too unrepentant to ever leave the halls of Mandos at all, according to the material in Morgoth's ring. His Fëa is essentially quarantined, refusing to leave even when permitted, consumed by its own fire. Compare that to Glorfindel, judged not just safe but useful enough to send back into the field. That's not a minor character footnote. That's Tolkien quietly telling you this elf spirit was assessed by the highest authority in Arda as exceptionally trustworthy and exceptionally strong. Keep that in mind, because premise 4 is going to complicate the word trustworthy in an interesting direction. One more thing worth noting before we move on, because I know somebody's already typing this in the comments. Yes, the name itself is doing quiet work here too. Glorfindel translates roughly to golden-haired or golden-tressed, tied to the house of the golden flower he leads at Gondolin, and Tolkien was never sloppy about names carrying weight. Compare it to how gold and light get used everywhere else in the Legendarium as a marker of things touched by the unmarred world. The light of the 2 trees, Laurelin specifically, the golden tree, versus the silver of Telperion. It's a small detail, but it's consistent with everything else this essay is telling us. Even his name is quietly flagging him as something closer to Valinor's light walking around in Middle-earth than an ordinary exile ever gets to be. And while we're on Gondolin's house structure, it's worth putting Glorfindel next to Ecthelion of the Fountain for a second, because the fan forum instinct to rank them against each other misses what Tolkien's actually doing by giving Gondolin more than one legendary defender. Ecthelion gets his own iconic single combat in the same battle against Gothmog himself, Lord of Balrogs, arguably an even higher value kill than Glorfindel's, and he dies doing it, dragging Gothmog down into one of the city's fountains with him. 2 of the greatest individual feats of arms in the entire First Age happen in the same few pages, in the same lost battle, by 2 lords of 2 different houses, and neither of them saves the city. That's not an accident of plotting. It's Tolkien making a point before he's even made the point explicitly anywhere else. Individual heroism, however extraordinary, doesn't override the shape of a doom that's already been set in motion by bigger forces, oaths, curses, the working out of the music. Glorfindel's later Restraint reads very differently once you've registered that the single greatest thing he ever did with a sword, in the moment fans most want to celebrate him for, still wasn't enough to save the city he died defending. That's a formative lesson if there ever was one. If you want the uncomfortable follow-up question, here it is. Does Ithilien get the same late-life reincarnation essay Glorfindel gets? He doesn't. As far as the published corpus goes, he stays dead, first age, no return. Tolkien never explains why one Lord of Gondolin gets sent back into the field and the other doesn't, and it's exactly the kind of gap that would have been resolved if he'd lived another decade to keep revising. The uncharitable read is that Glorfindel simply got more page time in The Lord of the Rings and needed retroactive justification Ithilien never required. The more interesting read, consistent with everything else in this essay, is that whatever Mandos judged about Glorfindel's fear, trustworthy, useful, safe to redeploy, wasn't automatically true of every hero who died gloriously in that same battle. Dying well doesn't appear to be sufficient on its own. Something about the specific shape of Glorfindel's death and what came after it in the halls of Mandos made him the exception, and Tolkien never tells us what, which is exactly the kind of open question this channel exists to sit in, rather than paper over with fan fiction certainty. Premise 2, and this is where I get to make the argument that's going to annoy anyone who's only ever thought about this scene in terms of who's stronger. Go back to the actual text of the Ford of Bruinen, not the Jackson version, the actual book. Glorfindel does not kill any of the 9. He doesn't need Elrond's flood, which by the way is Elrond's doing through Vilya and the power bound into Rivendell itself, not Glorfindel's, a detail people conflate constantly. Glorfindel's contribution is presence, light, and command sufficient to drive the riders back and keep them from crossing before the flood arrives. That's it, no sword fight, no dramatic duel, a standoff that he wins through sheer force of what he visibly is. Now why does that matter? Because it tells you something about restraint that lines up almost exactly with a piece of doctrine Tolkien lays out explicitly elsewhere, in letter 156, when he's explaining why the Istari are sent to Middle-earth as old men with deliberately curtailed power, instead of as Maiar operating at full strength. The reasoning he gives is that naked, overwhelming displays of power corrupt the wielder as surely as they threaten whoever they're used against. That's the entire justification for why Gandalf isn't just allowed to show up as Olorin in his full glory and end Sauron in an afternoon. Power that oversteps its sanctioned bounds becomes its own kind of tyranny, even when it's used against a legitimate threat. Glorfindel isn't a Maiar, and he's not operating under literally the same institutional restriction the Istari are. Nobody handed him a staff and told him to keep his true nature hidden inside an old man's body. But look at what he actually does with the capacity he clearly has. He is, after his return, one of the most potent incarnate beings walking around Middle-earth outside the Istari, full stop. And he spends the entire second and third age in supporting roles, scouting, escort duty, rearguard actions, standing at fords. He is never once shown seeking out Sauron directly, never leads an assault, never positions himself as the elves' answer to the Dark Lord, even though, on raw individual capability, he might genuinely have the strongest claim to that role of any elf left in Middle-earth by the Third Age. If he were simply less powerful than fans assume, that restraint would need no explanation. You don't hold back a fight you can't win, but the Ford tells you otherwise. He has more than enough in reserve to send 9 wraiths into a hesitant, unwilling retreat without so much as needing to draw a weapon that the text bothers to describe. That leaves you with restraint as a chosen doctrine, not restraint as a limitation forced on him by circumstance. And once you frame it that way, the entire shape of his Third Age career stops looking like an author underusing a cool character and starts looking like a deliberate portrait of someone who understands, on a level almost nobody else in the story does, exactly what the temptation of unrestrained power costs, which, funnily enough, is a lesson that gets tested directly on this exact same road a couple hundred pages later, when Frodo is offered the chance to use the ring against the very Witch King Glorfindels, already faced down once. Different kind of temptation, same underlying warning. There's a leadership detail buried in that same chapter that reinforces the point, and it's one the films flatten almost completely. On the road from Weathertop to the Ford, it's actually Glorfindel, not Aragorn, who makes the final operational calls about the party's route and pace once he catches up with them. Aragorn defers to him. That's a striking hierarchy for Tolkien to establish and then almost never revisit. Aragorn, future king of Gondor and Arnor, heir of Isildur, the character every adaptation treats as the unquestioned authority the moment he appears, quietly steps back and lets a elf lord none of the readers have met yet make the call. It only works dramatically because Tolkien trusts the reader to register competence without needing it explained. And it's exactly the kind of detail Jackson's script had no room to keep once Glorfindel's role got folded into Arwen's much more compressed arc. The books are telling you, in that handoff, that Glorfindel isn't just powerful in the abstract. He's the single most capable tactical authority in that entire company for the specific problem of getting a wounded hobbit past 9 wraiths alive. And Aragorn, of all people, recognizes it instantly and yields. It's also worth putting this next to Gandalf's own eventual unleashing, because the contrast sharpens the point. When Gandalf finally does let go of the restraint built into his mission, falling with the Balrog in Moria, dying and returning as Gandalf the White with a level of open, undisguised power he never displayed as Gandalf the Grey, Tolkien treats that as a genuinely exceptional event, something that required his death and a direct extension of his mandate to justify. It's not something he does lightly or often, and even after his transformation, he still doesn't march on Barad-dûr solo. Glorfindel never gets that narrative beat at all. No death, no transformation, no unleashing, because he's already operating with a version of that unrestrained clarity from the moment he steps back onto Middle-earth's shores, and he still never spends it carelessly. If anything, that makes his restraint more remarkable than Gandalf's, not less. Gandalf's restraint is written into his mission by the Valar as a structural limitation he has to accept. Glorfindel's restraint looks like something closer to a personal choice, exercised continuously by someone who could plausibly justify doing otherwise and simply doesn't. Premise 3, and this one is genuinely under-discussed even among people who've read the letters cover to cover. Standing over Frodo, Glorfindel says the Witch King of Angmar will not fall by the hand of man. Everybody remembers the line because it pays off spectacularly on the Pelennor fields, when Éowyn and Merry between them do exactly what no man technically can't. But look at the register that line is delivered in compared to how prophecy and foresight normally function for elves in this world. Most elves operating in Middle-earth by the Third Age are exiles running on memory, on grief, on instinct sharpened by an unbelievably long life, but not on anything you'd call actual foreknowledge. Galadriel gets closer to something prophetic than almost anyone else. Her mirror shows possible futures, contingent, shifting, hedged, and even she is careful never to claim certainty about what she shows Frodo and Sam. That hedging is the normal elvish register for anything future-facing. Glorfindel's line has none of that hedging. It's not phrased as a possibility. It's phrased as something closer to a fact he's simply reading off, the way you'd read a line off a page you'd actually seen, rather than guess at a shape in the dark. Unfinished Tales, in the chapter called The Hunt for the Ring, is where Christopher Tolkien preserves the fuller context of this prophecy, and quietly flags just how unusually confident and specific it is compared to the normal hedge-your-bets tone elvish foresight takes everywhere else in the text. And the question that raises, the one that sounds like fan theory overreach until you actually sit with the metaphysics we just spent the last stretch establishing, is why Tolkien hands this particular register of speech to a returned elf lord of Gondolin, instead of to Galadriel, who has the Noldorin royal pedigree, the Ring of Power, the entire resume you'd expect this kind of line to belong to. The uncharitable answer is that Tolkien just liked how the line landed dramatically and didn't think much harder about it than that. And honestly, with an author this prolific, that's always a live possibility with any single detail. But the more interesting reading, the one that actually fits with everything the late essay tells us about his re-embodiment, is that Glorfindel's return gave him a category of access ordinary incarnate elves don't have anymore. A thread of proximity to the music of the Ainur, to Eru's providence, that comes specifically from having been remade under direct Valorin sanction, rather than through the slow ordinary process everyone else goes through. He's not guessing about the Witch King's fate. He's the one character in the entire trilogy who sounds like he's already read the ending. And this connects to something rarely discussed about his Second Age career, buried in the appendices rather than dramatized anywhere on page. Glorfindel is one of the figures involved, however briefly mentioned, in the founding and defense of Rivendell itself. In the aftermath of the War of the Elves and Sauron, when Eregion falls, Celebrimbor is killed, and Elrond barely manages to hold a refuge together in the angle between the rivers. The histories are frustratingly thin here. Tolkien never gave us the full campaign narrative he clearly had in his head, but the broad strokes tell you Glorfindel was already doing exactly the same job in the Second Age that he's doing when we meet him properly in the Third. Not conquering, not leading grand offensives, but holding a line and buying time for something more fragile to survive behind him. That's the same shape as Gondolin. That's the same shape as the Ford. It's the same character doing the same job across two entire ages of the world, which is either a remarkable narrative consistency or, if you want the darker reading, a Tolkien detail suggesting the Valar keep sending him back to do exactly this because it's exactly what he's proven, over and over, he'll actually do without overreaching. Quick tangent, because I know somebody's going to bring it up anyway. Yes, the not by the hand of man phrasing has invited comparisons to Macbeth's witches for about as long as people have been reading this book critically, and Tolkien's own well-documented irritation with Shakespeare. He complained in his letters about how disappointingly literal the great Birnam Wood prophecy turns out to be on stage, just soldiers carrying branches. Makes it very tempting to read The Witch King's Fall as Tolkien quietly one-upping the bard on his own turf. Where Macbeth gets a cheap technicality, Tolkien builds an entire structural payoff, a woman and a hobbit, neither one technically a man of the Third Age's reckoning, acting together with Merry's blade, forged specifically in Cardolan generations earlier with spells meant to work against the Witch King's kind, doing the enabling work before Éowyn lands the finishing blow. That's not a technicality dressed up as fate. That's an entire chain of causality Tolkien had been quietly assembling since the Barrow Downs, paying off a promise Glorfindel makes almost the length of the whole book earlier. It's worth noticing that of everyone in the story who could have delivered that line, Tolkien chose the one character whose own return to life was itself an exception to the ordinary rules, which feels less like coincidence and more like Tolkien enjoying the symmetry of an exceptional being, naming an exceptional death in advance. There's a comparison worth making here to Círdan as well, since the two of them occupy oddly similar structural roles without anyone ever putting them side by side. Círdan is the elf who's been in Middle-earth the longest, never sailed west even when he had every opportunity, and quietly gives up his ring of power to Gandalf the moment he arrives, judging correctly that Gandalf will need it more and use it better. That's a different flavor of the same underlying virtue Glorfindel represents, restraint exercised by someone with obvious standing to claim more for himself and choosing not to. Middle-earth's Third Age survives on precisely this kind of quiet, unglamorous self-limitation from its oldest and most capable figures, and it's worth noticing how rarely the adaptations bother dramatizing that virtue at all, compared to how much screen time they give to characters seizing power instead of declining it. Which brings us to premise 4, the one where this channel usually gets loud, because it's tempting, genuinely tempting, to read everything we've covered so far as a straightforward power fantasy. Reincarnated hero, providence touched, drives off 9 wraiths without breaking a sweat, prophecies doom on the strongest of them with total confidence. So why isn't this guy just marching on Barad-dûr solo and ending the Third Age 40 years early? The answer isn't logistics, and it isn't a plot convenience excuse. The answer is Gondolin, and it's worth actually sitting with what happened there, instead of skating past it, the way most adaptations do. The Silmarillion gives you the compressed version. Glorfindel of the House of the Golden Flower, fighting a Balrog on a crag above the fleeing refugees of the fallen city, both of them going over the edge together, dead. It reads, in that compressed form, almost like a triumphant last stand, the kind of death ballads get written about. But Unfinished Tales gives you the fuller, uglier version, and the fuller version isn't triumphant, it's triage. Gondolin has already fallen. Morgoth's forces are pouring through a city that thought itself hidden and unconquerable for centuries. Idril and Tuer are leading a desperate column of survivors out through the secret way, and it's Glorfindel at the rear who ends up buying them the time they need with his own life, against an enemy he almost certainly knows he can't actually defeat. In a battle he enters anyway because someone has to, and there's nobody else positioned to do it. That's not the death of a hero who got to choose a glorious final confrontation on his own terms. That's the death of a guardian doing damage control in the middle of a catastrophe he didn't cause and couldn't have stopped, buying survival for people who will carry that cost with them for the rest of their lives. Eärendil, born to those very survivors, ends up being the one who eventually convinces the Valar to intervene at all, generations later. Glorfindel's death is a rearguard action inside a defeat, not a victory. It's also worth pausing on how the eagles factor into that same sequence, because it's another detail that undercuts the glorious solo hero reading people like to project backward onto him. It's Thorondor and his eagles who ultimately deal with the Balrog's ruin and recover Glorfindel's body for burial, not Glorfindel single-handedly settling the matter and walking away. He wins the exchange in the sense that the Balrog dies too and the refugees escape, but he doesn't survive to see any of it. There's no moment of triumph written into that scene for him personally, only cost. If you're building a character whose entire later restraint makes sense, that's exactly the kind of death you'd want on his record. Not a victory he got to enjoy, but a price he paid and never got to collect on. Now take that person, hand him genuine poster-man power on the level we spent the first half of this video establishing, and ask what he actually does with it once he's back in the field. He doesn't go looking for the biggest, flashiest confrontation available. He becomes exactly what he already was at Gondolin, a sentinel, a scout, the one riding to the border before the enemy arrives, the one meeting a handful of terrified hobbits on an empty road because somebody needed to be there and he made sure it was him. That's not an author failing to use a powerful character to his full potential. Read against what actually happened to him the first time. It's penance wearing the shape of a job description. He's already lived through what it costs to spend everything on one glorious stand, a burned city, thousands of years of separation from everyone he was trying to protect, a queen and a mariner forced to flee across the sea because the home he died defending didn't survive anyway. You don't come back from an experience like that itching for a rematch against something even bigger. You come back doing the quiet, unglamorous work of making sure as few people as possible ever have to have his last stand happen to them again. That's not weakness. That's the single most consistent character trait Tolkien gives him across two entire ages of the world, and it's the actual reason he never marches on Mordor, even once. Premise 5, and this is the strangest one, and I think genuinely the most underrated, because it's not really about Glorfindel's power level at all. It's about how the text itself instructs you to see him, mechanically, through somebody else's eyes. When Frodo is stabbed on Weathertop by the Morgul blade, he begins slipping toward what the essays gathered in Home 12 call the Wraith World, the unseen side of reality the Ringwraiths themselves permanently occupy, the place the ring and its wounds drag a bearer toward the longer they carry it, or the more grievously they're hurt by its servants. And when Frodo, half slipped into that state, looks at Glorfindel riding to meet them on the road to the ford, he doesn't see an elf lord in a cloak the way he'd have seen him a week earlier. The text describes him as a white figure that shone with a light of its own. That's not a poetic flourish thrown in for atmosphere. Tolkien is using Frodo's damaged sight as an actual instrument, telling the reader, mechanically, that Glorfindel is partly visible on the same plane the nine themselves occupy. Inverted, though, light where they are absence, presence where they are hunger and hollowed-out want. The essay, Of the Symbolism of the Unseen World, gathered in Home 12, lays out Tolkien's actual thinking on this in more systematic terms than the novel ever bothers to on the page. What it means for a being to register on that other plane at all, and what kind of spirit shows up there with real clarity rather than staying safely contained on the physical side of things. Ordinary elves, even powerful ones, don't appear to register there with anything like the same intensity. Their light stays mostly this world, mostly contained inside the Hrua the way it's supposed to. Glorfindel doesn't stay contained, and by now you should already know why. It's the exact same mechanism we established at the very start of this video. A fear that dominant, in a body built specifically to let it show through, is going to bleed across into whatever plane a strong enough spirit can be perceived on, whether or not that's convenient for anyone standing nearby with a stab wound and failing eyesight. It's worth noting Frodo isn't a one-off case here either. This same wraith-adjacent perception recurs and deepens across the whole journey, from the flashes he catches at Weathertop itself to what he sees at Amon Hen when the eye actively searches for him, and again faintly at the cracks of doom. Tolkien is building a slow, deliberate arc of Frodo's sight thinning across the entire book, and the ford scene is one of the earliest and clearest data points in that arc, which is part of why it's worth taking as seriously as the moments people usually flag, like the Amon Hen sequence. It cuts both ways too, and this is the detail that usually gets left out when people talk about this scene. The Nazgul themselves are described elsewhere as perceiving the world primarily through exactly this same unseen register. Sight and sound in the ordinary physical sense mean less to them than presence on the wraith plane does, which is part of why they're drawn so unerringly to the ring itself and to anyone actively wearing it. If that's how they perceive threats and objects of interest, then Glorfindel isn't just visible to them the way he's visible to Frodo's damaged eyes. He's arguably more legible to a ringwraith than an ordinary mounted elf lord in armor would be to human eyes, which reframes the entire standoff at the ford. It's not simply that Glorfindel scares off 9 servants of Sauron through some vague aura of goodness. It's that he is, in the specific sensory register those 9 creatures actually operate in, unmistakably and overwhelmingly present in a way that reads to them as exactly the kind of danger worth retreating from, the same way a physical soldier would retreat from someone visibly better armed. The light Frodo sees with his half-ruined eyes and the presence the Nazgul are recoiling from are, structurally, the same signal read by 2 very different kinds of sight. It's worth setting this next to how the Palantiri work too, since Tolkien is building out a whole consistent logic of perception beyond ordinary sight across these books, not just improvising one moment at the ford. The seeing stones let a mind reach across vast distances and perceive things and, crucially, be perceived back, which is exactly the trap that catches both Saruman and eventually Pippin, and very nearly catches Aragorn before he wrestles Sauron's attention through the Palantir by sheer force of will and lineage. Sauron's far sight isn't some vague metaphor for he's powerful and knows things. It's a specific in-world sensory channel with rules, and those rules are the same ones that make Frodo's ring-damaged perception at the ford meaningful evidence rather than just spooky flavor text. If a lesser mind looking through a stone can accidentally announce itself to Sauron just by being perceived clearly enough, then a being who shows up as unmistakably bright as Glorfindel does to a half-wraithed hobbit is not a being who's going to slip under anyone's radar, Sauron's included, the moment their attention ever actually crosses his way. And here's the implication almost nobody sits with, because it sounds too big for one Ford scene to be carrying. If Frodo's wraith-damaged sight can pick Glorfindel out as something categorically different from an ordinary elf, then it stands to reason Sauron's own far sight, the same sight capable of feeling out the ring's presence across half a continent, the same attention that fixes instantly on Frodo the moment he puts the ring on at Amon Hen, would register Glorfindel not as one more elf lord to route troops around, but as something much closer to what it would register Gandalf as, not a curiosity, a flag, something that shows up bright and unmistakable on whatever version of a map Sauron is reading the war from. Which is, finally, the actual answer to the question this whole video is titled after. It was never a hypothetical about whether Glorfindel could win a straight duel against the Dark Lord of Mordor in his tower, because nothing we've covered tonight supports that reading, and Tolkien never once suggests it. It's that Glorfindel is the one elf left in Middle-earth by the Third Age who would register to Sauron, instantly and unmistakably, as a genuinely different category of threat than every other elf lord left in the story, the way almost nothing else wearing an elvish face does, because the Dark Lord of everyone in Arda would know exactly what he was looking at when he looked at him. So here's how all 5 of these actually lock together, because Tolkien didn't write any of it as 5 disconnected cool facts for a YouTube video to string together decades later. He built one character who is, structurally, a single argument about providence, restraint, and grief functioning as one coherent system instead of pulling against each other the way they do in almost every other power fantasy character ever written. The reincarnation gives him the raw capacity, a body built to let an exceptionally strong spirit show through with almost no friction. The restraint at the Ford shows you he understands, better than nearly anyone else walking around Middle-earth in the Third Age, exactly why that capacity should never be spent carelessly. The prophecy shows you he's not running on memory and instinct the way every other exiled elf in the story is. He's got an actual thread of certainty most of them lost access to millennia ago. The guilt of Gondolin explains why he never once turns that capacity toward glory-seeking across 2 entire ages, despite clearly having the individual strength to make a real case for it. And Frodo's wraith sight tells you none of this is subtle to the beings who actually matter. Sauron would clock exactly what he's looking at the instant their attention crossed, the same way he clocks Gandalf and nobody else wearing pointed ears. And that's precisely the opposite of how every screen adaptation has handled this character. So let's close on the hot take you came here for. Jackson cut him entirely and handed his one great narrative beat to Arwen on horseback, which, credit where it's due, it's a genuinely strong scene. Nobody watching that Ford sequence for the first time is thinking this needed more exposition about Second Age Valorin dispensations. But it does erase the entire theological architecture we just spent this whole video rebuilding, and it quietly trains an entire generation of viewers to think Glorfindel either doesn't exist or was some minor book character, not worth the screen time. And if Rings of Power ever gets around to putting him on screen with the same hand it's used on half the rest of the Second Age's actual chronology so far, I'd brace myself for a Glorfindel who solves every problem by fighting it directly, because subtlety about restrained, undisplayed power has not exactly been that show's strongest instinct up to this point. Tolkien spent an entire late-life essay making absolutely sure this character's return made theological sense, layering providence and grief and restraint into a single coherent portrait most readers never noticed is even there. The very least any adaptation could do is let him stay quiet about how strong he actually is. That reticence isn't an absence of characterization. It is the characterization. It's the whole point of him. Sources for tonight: The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, The Lord of the Rings, The Peoples of Middle-earth, and Morgoth's Ring from the History of Middle-earth series, and the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, particularly letter 15:6. If you want to argue with any of the readings tonight, the comments are open, and I will absolutely die on the Gondolin as Penance Hill if it comes to that. New deep cuts every week here on Beyond the Rings. Subscribe if this is your kind of pub talk, and I'll see you in the next one.